The story is called sometimes The Widow at Nain. Nain is a town in Israel. There was a first century song that's little known. It's "The rain in Nain stays mainly on the plain." And that's where they got the song for My Fair Lady. Just a little bit that you can pass on after church to other people. It's Pride Month, and I always look forward to the Pride Parade. I love the Pride Parade. Even last year was so much fun in that downpour. But I love the Pride Parade, and one of the highlights for me is when we come up over that bridge by Nationwide, and it's kind of high, and you come off that bridge, and then you start to come down, and you see this mob of people in the short north, on the cap and all, and it's just thrilling. For me, it's all for me. It's just wonderful stuff. It's exhilarating, and I always feel sorry for people who aren't there or feel that they can't walk in the parade, because it's just life-giving to come down that hill into the mob in the short north. So I have this fantasy of this procession of thousands of people coming down this hill full of life and celebrative, and with throwing out things and music blaring, and coming from the other direction is another procession, and this procession would be maybe from the Westboro Church that pickets military funerals because the government stance on gays, or it might be from one of the churches that protests, or one of the churches that's interrupted our services here. And I think, wow, what would it be like, if this procession came from this way, and the Pride Parade came from this way, and they had such different agendas, and they met right in front of Hyde Park. What would happen? It would be so dramatic. I mean, if you were in the parade or witnessing it, you would go home and talk about what happened when the two processions met. So dramatic. Well, that's what I think is kind of going on in this story in the town of Nain. You have Jesus and his procession coming this way from outside the city, and it's full of life. Jesus is on a roll. He's probably the presumptive nominee, and he's people are feeling good about him. He's had some good teaching moments. He's in the previous story, in the previous town in Capernaum, he's raised the servant of the centurion, and he's done other miracles. And I bet people are just really festive, and maybe some people are running ahead of him, and they're looking around. Wow, this is a great crowd. And then coming from the other direction is this funeral procession. Now there would have been mourners leading the funeral procession, but Luke says, it's a particular kind of funeral procession. The woman is a widow, which means, she's lost some of her rights, and then it's her only son. It's not just her son; it's her only son who's died. Because she's a widow, she would have been dependent on her son, for support. And now he's dead. And there were some places where, when this happened to a widow, all of her property would revert to the husband's family. So this is particularly a procession of sadness. I mean, she's bereft. Not only is she grieving, but she's bereft of any support. So you have this procession of Jesus coming that's really festive, and you have her procession that's coming that's really sad. It is worth crying over. What is represented here is, life is coming from this side, and death is coming from this side. One writer has said, heaven is coming from this side. Heaven is joy and celebration and connection and union and oneness and happiness, and it's abundance, and it's life and energy. And hell is coming from this side. Hell is deprivation. Think of how you use that word. You do it for the hell of it. You don't have any purpose. You don't have any meaning. People talk about their marriage being a living hell. They work in hellish conditions. It's just the opposite of heaven. There is no connection. There is no oneness. There is no peace. There's no joy. There's nothing to celebrate. It's just grief and mourning. And you have these two processions coming in this story, and that's dramatic. And they meet at the gate. They meet at the gate. Now gates are in a sense a continuation of the fence. They're a continuation of the wall. Gates, when they're shut, either keep things in or keep things out. But they reinforce the separation that the wall creates. And you've got this separation now between life and death. And we kind of like our gates. We like our gates that keep things separate. Sometimes we like our gates and our doors so much, and we want them to be so effective that we put locks on them. We want them to be so effective that we key them to security systems. So if the gate is open or the door is open, an alarm will go off, and we can still keep things separate. We like our gates. Then when the gate is opened, things can get in, or things can get out. The dog can get out. The person can get in. So that's kind of the end of Act 1 of this drama. The two crowds are at the gate. And what's going to happen? Act 2 of the drama starts. Luke says, and Jesus saw the woman. He saw the woman. Sometimes we don't like to see that deprivation or that death. What are we going to say? What are we going to say to a person who's in hell? Think of that when you get off the exit ramp and there's that person holding that sign, "Will work for food," and your car ends up right next to that person. Do you look away? Do you start changing the dials on your radio? We might not want to see. We might not want to see that person panhandling in the short north. We might not want to see that person in the emergency room, in the hospital ward, in the nursing home. We might not want to see that person who's just lost his job, that person who's just lost her marriage. Thank God for caller ID. We can, it pops up and we know, I don't know that number, that's going to voicemail. That's another form of it. Jesus sees her. Jesus sees her. He doesn't turn away. He doesn't pretend she's not there. He sees her. Then the next scene is he has compassion on her. Translation that Sherry read says, his heart was broken. The word that's used for compassion here, it relates to a visceral gut-wrenching. His guts were all twisted up. It's the word that Luke uses for the Good Samaritan. When the Good Samaritan sees the man beaten by the side of the road, he has compassion. His guts were turned. It's the word that's used when the father sees the prodigal son returning home. He felt it in his gut. The Hebrew word for compassion is related to womb, at labor pains. But Jesus has this compassion, this great feeling for this woman. Not only does he see her, he has this great feeling for her. One of the translations, most of the translations say, the Lord had compassion. That would have been an odd statement back then. It would have been an odd statement because God didn't have feelings. God didn't have compassion. God didn't have this gut-wrenching experience when God looked at human suffering. God was supposed to be above all that. God was not supposed to be moved by what went on earth. So when Luke says, Jesus, the Lord had compassion, that's an extraordinary statement. It's to reimagine how we see God, that God does suffer. God does feel when we suffer. It's the notion of a suffering God. William Sloane Coffin, when he talked about his son's death at the age of 20, it was a drunken car accident. He said, he felt that God's heart was the first to break when his son died. That notion always gives me comfort that God's heart was the first to break at a tragedy. Jesus had compassion. The next thing it says is, and he went to her. He walked through the gate. He walked through the gate. And in this case, it was a gate where life entered and went to death. Life entered the realm of death to bring life. Heaven entered the realm of hell to bring celebration and joy. Jesus stands in the gap and brings heaven to earth. And it says he touched the bier. He touched the hearse. He touched the hearse. Now, in that society, he would have been rendered temporarily unclean, just temporarily, as would, I'm sure, the people who were carrying the bier, driving the hearse. So it was a risk for him to touch that. He would have been made unclean and kind of excluded from community, and that might have been difficult when he had such a large following and he was on a roll. He was willing to associate with the people in hell. He was willing to associate with those who were grieving, those who had lost their jobs, those who were homeless, those who were hungry, those who had lost their partners and lost their homes. He was willing to associate with them. Another thing that interests me that Jesus was at risk in doing this is when he entered the gate and touched the bier, there's always the possibility when we go out on a limb and show our vulnerability for another person that they will reject us. You see these at football games, at baseball games. Somebody will arrange to go out to the pitcher's mound or the 50-yard line and propose to their partner in front of 10,000 people, 100,000 people. Have you ever wondered what it'd be like if the other person said no? I mean, think of the embarrassment on the Jumbotron, No, I don't want to marry you. We'll talk later. It's like when I proposed to Susan. She looked at me, we were in the car, red light, and I turned to her and I said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "Are you kidding?" I'm glad we were alone. But you always want that when you go out on a limb to express love to somebody, you make yourself vulnerable, and the person can say no. I don't want your gift. I don't want your apology. I don't want your forgiveness. I don't want you. I mean, you can be rejected, and Jesus is facing this issue of they could reject him. Get away from us, Jesus. And they stop. They stop. Jesus touches the bier, and they stop. They accept what he's doing. They accept him. I just wonder what it would have been like had they kept on walking. Would the young man have been raised from the dead had they just kept on walking and blown Jesus off? We have to stop in order to receive the presence of Jesus. And I wonder how, I know that I don't stop enough in life. I'm really too busy to stop and take the time to see what's going on around me. Jesus stops, they stop. There's a mutuality. And the only way they can receive heaven on earth, the only way this life can be transformed, if they stop and let Jesus be with them. The man is transformed. Heaven comes to hell. This is dramatic that he raises this person from the dead. I read a story of a very simple story this week of heaven coming to hell, of life coming to death. It was told by the British officer when the British had liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp at the end of World War II. And the officer said, just when we liberated it, that didn't mean the death stopped. That people were so devastated by what had been done to them that at least 500 a day continued to die of disease and starvation, and they were just too weak. And the scenes of the concentration camp, even after it was liberated, he said, were hellish. And he said, people didn't have clothes. He went into it in detail. I'm not going to. And he said, one of the things that happened was that the British Red Cross started sending food and clothes and so on. But the first shipment they got was cases of bright red lipstick. And he said, what a dumb thing to send. What a dumb thing to send. And he said, but we thought, well, what the heck? And we opened the cases and started giving the red lipstick out to people. And he said, they started to put the lipstick on their lips. And he said, that was the only color in the concentration camp. The red lipstick. And he said, people started smiling. That this simple thing transformed lives and brought life into death. And I thought, holy crow. We don't have to raise people from the dead. We just have to give them red lipstick. I mean, we can do that. We can do that. Luke ends this story by saying, the people were amazed, and they exclaimed, a great mystery has come among us, and this is a place of holy mystery. And they were quietly worshipful and loudly grateful. This is a place of holy mystery. What had been a place of death, what had been a place of hell on earth, what had been a place of deprivation and loneliness, had now become a holy mystery. They stopped for Jesus, and it became a place of holy mystery and transformation. So, if you had these two processions meet on High Street in 2 weeks, and this kind of thing happened, you'd probably go home and tell people about it. The crowd went home and told people about it. And I think if I were in that crowd, not only would I tell people about it, I would tell them about life coming to death and lives being transformed. And I'd think, maybe I should do more than tell people. Maybe I should have the compassion. And maybe I ought to start giving lipstick to people so that their lives can be transformed. May it be so.